Record number 1023. Patient, Lysander Crowe. Age at admission, 38 years. Date of admission, October 22, 1895. Initial diagnosis, bipolar disorder with episodes of manic euphoria and extreme impulsivity, followed by severe and introspective depressions, exacerbated by a heavy workload and social isolation. What goes on in the mind of a man living in the shadow of his own sanity? Lysander Crowe, 38 years old, an artist whose talented hands bear the weight of a fragmented mind, finds himself confined in Blackwood Asylum. The institution, a Gothic building that seems ripped from a nightmare, exudes mystery and unease. Its narrow, stifling corridors, illuminated by the dim light of gas lamps, sway in a movement that makes the shadows on the walls appear alive. Each step echoes like a dissonant note, a constant reminder that, within these walls, no one is truly alone. The distant screams of other patients shatter the silence with a disturbing frequency, reverberating through the walls as if the building itself were crying out. Lysander, a newcomer, observes everything with a meticulous gaze. There is a mix of fascination and horror in his eyes as he examines his fellow inmates, each one a personification of suffering. He notices their tense breaths, as if the air in the place were too heavy to be inhaled without effort. The initial diagnosis of bipolar disorder, recorded with clinical precision in his file, describes only part of the truth. Lysander knows that the battle he fights is not merely against the devastating highs and lows of his condition. The memories of euphoric times haunt him, moments when every idea emerged with the force of a comet lighting up a dark night, only to be followed by dizzying falls into an existential void. He vividly recalls the ecstasy of painting for days on end, not stopping to eat or sleep, until his energy evaporated, leaving only the echo of silence and the shadows of his own mind. The doctors at Blackwood try to convince him that medication will stabilize his condition, but Lysander sees in their faces something that goes beyond mere professional concern. To him, the doctors are threatening figures, masks of a larger and darker machine. He observes them like a surrounded predator, interpreting every gesture as part of a scheme to tame him, to steal his creative essence and reduce his being to an object of study. They would never understand his art, his almost visceral need to express the storms that consumed him. For Lysander, painting is more than an escape, it is survival. The asylum's walls, covered with portraits of forgotten patients, reinforce the feeling of isolation. He feels as though he is being watched, not only by the other inmates but by the figures in the paintings. Their eyes seem to follow his movements, their distorted faces reflecting something Lysander cannot name. He wonders if the souls of those who have been there still linger over the place, trapped between reality and delirium. Every brushstroke he makes on his canvases within the asylum is a struggle to capture that indescribable essence, but the images that emerge are fragmented and disturbing, like nightmares he has never had but still seem to belong to him. With each passing day, Lysander Crowe felt that his mind was a battlefield where the enemy and the ally shared the same face. Mornings began with an energy that felt divine, moments when he believed he could decipher the secrets of the universe with a simple brushstroke. He would wake with a sense of absolute power, as if he could shape reality with his hands. However, these bursts of euphoria were as fleeting as they were devastating. Soon, they gave way to an overwhelming darkness that paralyzed him, making even the act of breathing a struggle against an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. The Asylum Blackwood seemed to know this. Its ancient, stained walls appeared to absorb the energy he exuded, returning it as an oppressive force, a constant reminder that he could never escape, not even within himself. He felt the environment react to his state. When euphoria overtook him, the shadows on the walls seemed to retreat, withdrawing with an almost mystical respect. But when melancholy engulfed him, they drew closer, wrapping around him like sinuous serpents, whispering words he did not understand. The muffled laughter he swore he heard in the crevices of the stone now seemed clearer, more directed. It was not just his imagination, he thought, it was the building itself mocking him. The shadows transformed into anthropomorphic figures, pulsating outlines of shapes that seemed alive, moving only when he averted his gaze. He felt them, not as an external presence, but as a reflection of the chaos that inhabited his mind. Indistinct whispers and gentle wind, his art had become a disturbing reflection of his fragmented mind. The images that emerged from his hand were no longer the soul-filled landscapes or portraits he had once created. Now, they were disfigured monsters, empty eyes that seemed to devour those who dared to look at them, outstretched hands reaching for something unattainable. He began to avoid looking directly at his own paintings, fearing that the figures within them might, in fact, be alive, waiting for the right moment to emerge. That afternoon, when Lysander Crowe was summoned for forced therapy, the weight of the room enveloped him like a suffocating cloak. The office, small and devoid of any human warmth, felt like a dissection chamber, where souls were dissected with words disguised as interest. The yellowish light from the lamp flickered slightly, casting shadows that crawled along the walls. The doctor, a motionless and stoic figure, sat behind a desk cluttered with notes. His eyes pierced Lysander like sharp blades, and every word he spoke carried a false softness, as if he were trying to tame a beast on the verge of attacking. "You've been painting a lot lately, haven't you?" the doctor asked, leaning slightly forward. Lysander stared at him in silence, his fingers nervously drumming on the arms of the chair. The question felt like an attack, a disguised accusation. He knew what they wanted: confessions, surrenders. But his mind was a labyrinth, and he was determined not to give them the thread of Ariadne. "Yes," he finally replied, the word escaping like a heavy sigh. "Painting is the only thing that keeps the shadows away." But upon saying this, he realized the contradiction. It was the shadows that inhabited his canvases, that guided him, that tormented him. "Or perhaps, they are the ones that feed me," he murmured, more to himself than to the doctor. "What exactly are you talking about, Lysander?" the man in the white coat pressed, leaning in closer. The look in the doctor's eyes was not one of curiosity, but of caution, as if he feared that something might escape from within Lysander. The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to fill every corner of the room. When Lysander finally spoke, his voice was filled with an almost religious fervor. "My paintings show what lies beyond these walls. What you try to hide. You think you can silence everything with your drugs, but I see. I feel. You are afraid because you know I am closer to the truth than all of you put together." The doctor averted his gaze for a moment, taken aback. In his notes later, he would write, "Patient exhibits severe paranoid tendencies. Speech of a grandiose and delusional nature. Reinforce medication administration." But for Lysander, that moment was a victory. He felt he had instilled doubt in that man, even if just for a second. Later that same night, Lysander refused the medication again. He had developed an almost perfect technique, hiding the tablets in his mouth, pretending to swallow them, and then discarding them in a small hole he had found in the wall next to his bed. Each tablet he discarded was like a small rebellion, a declaration that his mind, as fragmented as it was, still belonged to him. But the cost of this rebellion was high. The nights became a battlefield. Sleep fled from him like a cornered animal, and the whispers in his mind turned into deafening screams. He could hear the creaking of the walls, as if the asylum itself were alive, moving around him. The shadows ceased to be mere stains in the darkness, they took on form and movement. He saw contorted figures, with elongated limbs and faces that dissolved like paint running in water. Sinister laughter in the background. One early morning, he was overcome by an irresistible compulsion to paint. In a frenzy, he tore the sheet from his bed and improvised a canvas. He used blood from his own fingers as paint, mixing it with the remnants of charcoal he had found days earlier in the courtyard. The images that emerged were chaotic and deeply disturbing: distorted faces, mouths open in silent screams, eyes overflowing with an infinite void. When he finally stopped, sweating and exhausted, he looked at the work and felt a deadly chill run down his spine. The figures were not creations. They were familiar. The Asylum Blackwood seemed to breathe in time with the despair of Lysander Crowe. Every step he took in the cramped corridors seemed to reverberate in harmony with the whispers surrounding him, now more insistent, almost intimate. They were not merely sounds, they were fragmented words, pieces of phrases he could not fully assemble. It was as if something within the asylum was trying to speak to him, but the message remained hidden, distorted, like a song being played backwards. The shadows, once mere spectators, had become the protagonists of his nightmare. They moved with an intention that Lysander could not comprehend, gliding along the walls with a fluidity that defied the laws of nature. One moment, they were just smudges on the periphery of his vision. In the next, they transformed into grotesque creatures, filled with empty eyes that watched him with a ravenous attention, gaping mouths that seemed ready to swallow him whole. He tried to look away, but something about these shapes compelled him to face them. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was the sensation that the truth he sought was hidden there. One night, while the storm roared outside, Lysander was awakened by a peculiar sound. It was not just the wind howling or the rain beating against the windows, there was something more. A muffled cry, mingled with the sound of the wind, seemed to call to him. He got up, his bare feet touching the cold floor, and followed the sound like a man in a trance. The corridors he once knew appeared different now, narrower, more oppressive. The sound led him to a door he had never noticed before. The wood was worn, and the doorknob, rusty, seemed to silently scream for him not to touch it. Nevertheless, he pushed the door open. What he found inside defied any logical description. The walls of the room were covered with a multitude of drawings, paintings, and scrawled words that seemed to compete for space. Everything was interconnected, forming a chaotic web that seemed to pulse with its own energy. Each image was more disturbing than the last, faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror, deformed bodies twisting as if trying to escape an invisible pain, hands outstretched in search of something they could never reach. On the floor, around a rusty wooden chair, were scattered broken brushes, empty paint tubes, and notebooks that seemed to have been hastily filled. Lysander felt an intense chill coursing through his body as he knelt beside the chair. He leafed through one of the notebooks with trembling fingers, each page bringing forth something darker than the last. The words written seemed to whisper directly into his mind, "They are watching us. Art is the way to escape. There is no way out." The floor began to tilt beneath his feet, and the air around him became dense, almost impossible to breathe. The voices in the room grew deafening, a cacophony of screams, laughter, and cries that filled every corner of the space. He tried to scream, but the sound of his own voice was swallowed by the voices surrounding him. When he finally managed to stand and leave the room, he felt as if he had left a part of himself behind, a fragment he could never reclaim. In the following days, Lysander delved even deeper into his art. He painted frantically, as if trying to capture something that was always just out of reach. But now, his works seemed to have a life of their own. The brushstrokes he had applied dried into shapes he did not recognize, as if guided by another force. The faces in the painting seemed to move when he glanced at them, and in one of his more recent pieces, he saw something that made his heart race, his own face, emerging from the shadows on the canvas. But something was wrong. The eyes were not his. The voices began to call his name, first in subtle whispers during the night, but then with a frequency that terrified him. They were not just echoes in his mind, he swore he could hear them even in moments of profound silence. Worse, they began to follow him during the day, calling to him in therapy sessions, in the corridors, and even when he was surrounded by other patients. He began to respond, murmuring disjointed words that escaped his lips before he could control them. This did not go unnoticed by the doctors, who meticulously noted his deteriorating mental state. One afternoon, while painting with the same frenetic urgency as always, his hand suddenly stopped. He felt as if something invisible was guiding his movements. The brush, almost without his permission, began to form words in the bottom corner of the canvas, "You have been here before." The words were simple, but carried a weight that made him drop the easel. He recoiled, stumbling, as the words etched themselves into his mind like a mantra, like an endless cycle. Lysander began to question everything. Was he really a new inmate? Or had he been destined for this place all along? Were the doctors right in saying that his mind had already been shattered before he even arrived? Or was the Asylum Blackwood itself the source of all madness, a place where time and sanity disintegrated, where no truth was absolute? The environment around Lysander Crowe not only throbbed, it seemed to want to swallow him whole. The walls of the Asylum Blackwood, alive with restless movement, were closing in on him, as if the space around him was shrinking, pressing in with an invisible force. He could feel the heat of the shadows, a morbid breath that carried the scent of decay and buried memories, as if the asylum itself exhaled the essence of the souls it had consumed. Time, that volatile element he had once captured in his works, was now becoming an enemy. The seconds dragged on as if burdened by chains, yet escaped as quickly as water slipping through his fingers. The corridors, once merely labyrinthine, had transformed into tunnels of torment, a space where every shadow cast a grotesque spectacle. He saw twisted shapes, figures that seemed to struggle to escape the walls, their deformed hands emerging from the cracks before vanishing like smoke. Every detail of these movements seemed choreographed to torment his sanity, to remind him that there was no escape. The inmates, who had once been mere supporting characters in his horror, now had faces resembling masks of a macabre carnival. Their black eyes followed him, and their grotesque faces expressed a disturbing mixture of laughter and tears. They didn't need to speak, their expressions were more eloquent than any word, silent accusations that pierced Lysander like blades. Among the distorted faces that populated his mind, one emerged clearly: Eleanor. His lost love, his muse, and his damnation. Her expression, frozen in time, bore a deep sadness and a cutting disdain. He heard her voice, muffled and distant, yet unmistakable. "You let me sink," she said, her words echoing not in the space, but within his very being. Each syllable was a blow, unearthing layers of guilt he had tried to bury. The lamp above him flickered violently, casting a beam of light that shattered against the cracks of a nearby mirror. He didn't remember approaching that mirror, but there it was, staring back at its irregular surface. The cracks in the glass formed patterns that resembled chaotic maps of his life, each line a wrong choice, each fragment a moment of regret. When he finally looked at his reflection, what he saw was not a man, but an abomination composed of 1,000 pieces. Each fragment showed a part of him he wished to forget. His eyes, deep-set and surrounded by shadows, were nearly consumed by the darkness growing inside him. In the reflection, something moved behind him. He turned abruptly, but the corridor was empty. When he turned his gaze back to the mirror, the figure was there again, closer this time. Its shape was indistinct, made of pure shadows, with eyes like two luminous wells that seemed to pierce his soul. "You know what you are, don't you?" The voice was low, almost a whisper, yet carried an ancestral and terrifying force. "You are not a creator. You are a tool. A means. Everything you painted, everything you did, was because we allowed it." Lysander tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat, suffocated by the weight of the moment. He fell to his knees, his fingers gripping the cracks in the mirror as he sought support. The figure stared at him, motionless, as if waiting for something, and then the truth hit him like a cold blade. He was not the artist of his own life. He was the brush. The spiral of madness in his mind became a voracious whirlwind. He heard the voices of the doctors, the screams of the patients, the whispers of the shadows, and even the lamentations of Eleanor, all blending into an unbearable cacophony. The asylum, he realized, was not just a place. It was a state of being, a prison designed to capture not bodies, but souls. And, in understanding this, a new truth emerged: he had never entered Blackwood. He had always been there. With trembling hands, Lysander rose. The mirror before him had changed again. It was no longer a reflection but a painting. The work, vibrant and horrendous, seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. It depicted endless corridors, shadows moving with dark intentions, and disfigured faces crying out for salvation. In the lower corner of the canvas, he saw the artist's name signed, Asylum Blackwood. Lysander stood on the edge of a precipice, but this was not made of stone or tangible reality. It was an abyss of consciousness, a space where every thought reverberated like a scream and every memory twisted into cruel caricatures. The asylum, now a living organism around him, seemed to grow fatter with every piece of his sanity. The shadows, once peripheral figures, now surrounded him completely, enveloping him in a suffocating embrace. The figure that accompanied him remained by his side, motionless, its empty eyes fixed on him. Its mere presence was an accusation, an unrelenting reminder that there was nowhere to escape. Lysander tried to look into the mirror again, seeking something that could guide him back to the light, but what he saw was not redemption. It was an endless cycle of images, corridors stretching infinitely, doors opening to reveal indescribable horrors, and human figures reduced to specters of suffering. Among these images, a pattern emerged. He saw himself repeatedly, in different moments, in different places within the asylum. In one instant, he was sitting in a room surrounded by doctors, his face blank. In another, he was alone in a chamber, painting frantically as tears streamed down his face. And in every scene, the figure in the shadows was there, watching. "You cannot escape because you never entered," the voice murmured again, this time closer. Lysander tried to retreat, but there was nowhere left to go. The words sliced through his mind like blades. He felt the walls around him closing in, the space shrinking, forcing him to confront the truth. The asylum was him. Every shadow, every scream, every door that Lysander Crowe had opened, everything was part of his own fragmented mind. The overwhelming realization hit him like a wave, dragging away any trace of resistance. He was not just a lost patient amid the madness of Asylum Blackwood. He was the architect and the prisoner, the executioner and the victim, entwined in an endless cycle of agony and creation. His art, which he once deemed an attempt to capture the truth, revealed itself to be a treacherous mirror. Every brushstroke he made was yet another cord tied to the labyrinth of his own mind, yet another knot in the noose that bound him to eternity. When the figure in the shadows finally emerged, it bore the face he knew better than any other, his own. It was not a reflection, but a distorted version stripped of humanity. The face was empty of everything that made it human, filled only with guilt, pain, and despair. The eyes of this figure were two deep abysses, and Lysander felt that if he looked long enough, he would be swallowed by them. "You have always been part of this," the figure said, its voice reverberating as if it came from the very bowels of the asylum. The words mingled with the heavy air, the pulsating walls, and the persistent hum that filled the corridors. It was impossible to discern where the voice ended and the asylum began. Lysander fell to his knees, defeated. The cold floor welcomed him like a cruel lover, and he felt his tears stream down his face, burning like acid. Each drop seemed to carry a fragment of his pain, but it was insufficient to relieve him. The weight of his guilt and the knowledge he now possessed was unbearable. He knew then that there was no escape, no redemption. Asylum Blackwood was not just a place. It was him. An extension of his mind, a physical manifestation of his failures, of his distorted creations, and of his deepest fears. He was destined to wander its corridors forever, surrounded by the shadows of everything he had tried to create and destroy. The voices began to swell, transforming into a cacophony of whispers and screams that filled every space. The words, indistinct at first, became clearer, forming an inescapable mantra: "You are the cycle. You are the cycle." They came from all sides, echoing in the void that surrounded him, even from within him. When the darkness embraced him completely, Lysander did not resist. He surrendered to the void, accepting the fate that awaited him. There was no more struggle, no more questions. The terror of Lysander Crowe was not what he had found inside the asylum. It was the unbearable truth that he was Asylum Blackwood itself. He always had been. And he always would be. The Asylum Blackwood is not merely a building. It is a labyrinth of despair, where the echoes of those who came before weave an unending symphony of torment. Its cold, silent corridors hold the traces of fractured minds, etched in faded symbols, fragmented records, and haunting visions that defy comprehension. Every whisper, every shadow, tells a piece of a story that was never meant to be uncovered, a tapestry of horror that grows darker with every turn. The asylum itself seems alive, a sentient entity guarding its secrets, daring only the boldest to uncover the truths lurking within. Subscribe now to unlock the chilling mysteries still hidden in the depths of Asylum Blackwood. But tread carefully, once the darkness calls, it may never let you go. Are you prepared to step inside and face what the shadows conceal?